This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And make sure to order Jamie Glazov's new critically acclaimed jihadist Psychopath. How he is charming, seducing, and devouring us. All your support is greatly appreciated.
The largest Islamic terrorist organization in the world is not Al-Qaeda, which these days is a sad shell of its former self. Always sad if you're an Islamic terrorist or support them. It's not ISIS, which is also a sad shell of its former self. Again, sad if you're an Islamic terrorist or support them, in which case you're pretty sad to begin with. It's actually the Quds Force. Now, there's a reason that you don't hear very much about the Quds Force. The Quds Force is Iran's means of implementing its influence and power around the world and especially across the region. And Qasem Soleimani, the media's latest martyr, the guy whom the Washington Post, CNN, CBS, and so many other news outlets refer to as revered. He's not very revered in Iran, where he's widely hated, but he certainly is revered in the media in parts of Georgetown. He headed the Quds Force, which really, if you think about really some of the highest profile Islamic terrorist groups in the world, they had their origins in the Quds Force, particularly Hezbollah. If you think about some of the most spectacular Islamic terrorist attacks around the world, yes, including 9/11, they had links to the Quds Force. The Quds Force was largely a means of projecting Islamic power through Shiites, obviously. So Hezbollah which is really arguably one of the larger Shiite Islamic terrorist groups, certainly one of the more heavily armed Islamic terrorist groups around. But it also extends to various Sunni organizations, including Hamas. And I should backtrack a little bit. The Quds Force, if you know any actual Islamic theology, Al-Quds is the Islamic name for Jerusalem, or what Jews call Yerushalayim. To Muslims claim that it is the holy city, Al-Quds. And therefore, the Quds Force, really, its brand is that it is going to take on Israel. It's going to take over Jerusalem and turn it into Al-Quds, where Muhammad will once again be able to fly his flying demon horses with the heads of women in night dreams over to Jerusalem. But I digress a little bit. The point being that the Quds Force was always meant to be an aggressive international terrorist group. It was not about protecting Iran internally. It was not even about border disputes because Israel does not share a border with Iran. So the Quds Force was always meant to spread terrorism abroad. And as head of the Quds Force, Soleimani certainly did that. And while he certainly inflicted damage on Israel, he certainly played a role in the murder of Israelis, he played a far greater role in the murder of Americans. Because what the Quds Force did really well was set up satellite, you might call them puppet terrorist groups. This is also, of course, what led to Soleimani's downfall, when one of his puppet groups went after the United States Embassy in Baghdad. You have a whole lot of Democrats and all the media claiming that this was just an unprovoked, aggressive attack. No, this is what happens when you attack the United States Embassy and when the guy in the White House at the time is not named Barack Hussein Obama. But the embassy attack was fairly typical of how Soleimani and the Quds Force operated. The Quds Force is fairly large. That's why I called it the largest group. But most of really its power, its influence was wielded through satellite, puppet, proxy, other terrorist groups like Hezbollah, for example. And what Soleimani was able to do was actually build around this kind of regional ring of satellite terrorist groups, puppet terrorist groups, that gave it control over key parts of the region, particularly in Lebanon, while doing it fairly on the cheap. So Soleimani personally was amazing at enriching himself. He was moving billions of dollars, particularly from troubled regions. So much like the Nazis, he was able to both profit from the chaos and cause chaos. But Soleimani, again, as I mentioned, did really well, was actually wield Iran's influence by supplying, arming, and training local terrorist groups, setting them up and setting them loose, particularly against America. Now, when I mentioned that Soleimani has a lot of American blood in his hands, I'm not talking about the attack in Baghdad, which, of course, obviously could have been much worse. But this time, the United States military and the United States Embassy was not run by people answering to Obama, who first impulse on having an United States Embassy attacked is to quickly bring up the YouTube app and look for offensive videos that might be blamed for this attack. No, this time around, the United States actually had the full measure and the full resources in the military, the full backing of the commander-in-chief to respond, to strike back, and to crush the people responsible. That's what we actually saw then, and that's what has the Democrats and the media so infuriated and outraged. But it goes back far before this, because what Soleimani did really well was actually use the fighting in Afghanistan, use the fighting in Iraq to kill a lot of Americans by supplying weapons and particular IEDs to the so-called insurgents, the Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, the interesting thing about about Iran and the Quds Force, particularly supplying IEDs to the Taliban, was that originally they had actually been fighting the Taliban. The Taliban had not wanted Shiites in Afghanistan. Now, the Quds Force, Iran in general, they are just seen like the posturous protectors of Shiites. In Afghanistan, they demonstrated very, very clearly that even while the Taliban were murdering Shiites, their priority was killing Americans. They were willing to ally with the Taliban, who were killing their fellow Shiites. They were willing to ally with Al-Qaeda, who were killing their fellow Shiites, in order to kill American soldiers. And they did kill quite a few American soldiers. Again, indirectly, this is the MO of the Quds Force, which is to supply weapons training to local terrorist groups who would actually do the dirty work. And Soleimani was a kind of a CEO, an international global CEO of Islamic terrorism. This was kind of the thing that Osama bin Laden wanted to be, but Osama bin Laden was pretty terrible at it because Osama bin Laden would end up actually trying to take center stage. Soleimani, of course, was also like Osama bin Laden in that way because he loved being photographed. You will see all these photos of Soleimani making him the center of everything and building his own cult of personality, because Soleimani's real ambition was to take power, was to become the president of Iran. Unless they really do a Weekend at Bernie's style thing where they just prop him up and drag him around, I don't think that one's happening after the drone got through with him. But Soleimani, really, his downfall came because he was a glory hound, was a publicity hound. He very much wanted to be seen. In the past, he'd been this kind of shadowy figure. The Quds Force had carried out devastating attacks like the bombing of the Jewish Center in Buenos Aires, while at the same time corrupting local authorities and creating plausible deniability. Now, when Iran did this, it was very effective because on one hand, you knew that Iran did it. On the other hand, nobody could actually technically prove it. In the later years, Soleimani began to become more grandiose. He was increasingly more and more open and overt about waging this war, not just on Israel, but on America. And at the time when Soleimani and the Quds Force were supplying weapons to the Taliban, for example, they did this again with plausible deniability. This time around, they were increasingly became overt. In the last year or so, Soleimani and the Quds Force were more and more closely linked to rocket attacks against Americans. Now, this was a particularly stupid idea. And now Soleimani had this sense of confidence and vulnerability because the Obama administration had actually struck a deal with Iran. Part of the Iran nuke deal was that eventually sanctions would be lifted on Soleimani, which they took as a sign that America is completely folded, America is completely surrendered. The Obama administration even reportedly pressured Israel into not going after Soleimani. Now, in 2018, it's the Trump administration. They actually give the green light to Israel to go after Soleimani. At this point, we think Soleimani becomes very careful about moving around Syria because he knows Israel now has the green light to go after him. But he's very comfortable moving around Baghdad. He's in his home turf. It's Shiite-controlled. It's the Shiite central government. Israelis are not going to strike that far. It's very unlikely. It would be a very risky operation. For example, the Israeli strike against Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor was an incredibly bold, daring, and hugely risky operation. So he's not particularly worried about that, with good reason. And he also thinks America is weak. I mean, to guys like this, democratic elections are not real. So from his perspective, America was weak under Obama. It's going to be weak under Trump. So he's thinking he's going to continue getting away with murder. And at this point, his hands are getting more and more dirtier. The connections between him and the actual attacks are becoming more and more blatant. And he loves this kind of thing. He feeds off the publicity. He feeds off this glory. So not only does he actually stagecraft an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, he has to go meet with the guy at the head of this whole thing, and he figures that America is not going to do anything, that there can be photos of him, and that it's going to be a further sign of just how Iran is invulnerable. Iran is, as Obama liked to say, on the right side of history. It's going to win. And boom, the hammer comes down. Goodbye, Soleimani. Goodbye this whole sense that Iran is invulnerable, that it's not going to be touched, they can keep pushing further and further, and it's going to be just fine. And this is a huge game changer because Soleimani had actually made himself the public face of Quds. Now, there's no question that he was a very talented strategic military commander. He was very good at this. He was also very good at the politics of it. He could go into a country like Syria or Lebanon. He would understand the political ties. He would understand the strategic issues. He would be able to set up terrorist groups, but would also be very good at the political maneuverings. And that's not a very common quality in terrorist leaders. For example, Osama bin Laden was terrible at the political side of things. He was not terribly good at anything except being a rich boy, honestly, and making videos for Al Jazeera. The Caliph of ISIS, we don't know exactly everything about that, but ISIS was very effective militarily. In terms of propaganda, it was very effective, but it alienated just about everybody it came across because it was just determined to fight everybody. So Soleimani, on the hand, he could bring Shiites and Sunni terrorist groups together. He could forge these temporary alliances. He was very good at manipulating and using covert agendas. But again, his downfall, as the Greeks would have it, was hubris. He needed to become the center of attention, and while it was safe to do so under Obama, it was not safe to do so under Trump. He assumed that America under Trump was as weak as it was under Obama, that his dirty deeds would continue going unpunished. He was proven to be very, very wrong. There's a lesson in here for terrorists who, of course, will never learn that lesson. But suffice it to say that Soleimani had a great deal of American blood, of Israeli blood, and of blood of people around the world on his hands. The Quds Force launched not only countless operations which killed Americans indirectly and quite likely directly, it also plotted a terrorist attack inside the United States. It plotted countless terrorist attacks against Americans, and it really was the driver for Iran's vision of being able to consolidate, control, and rule over the region, to restore this kind of Persian empire, this time under the rule of Islam and the rule of the supreme leader. And if Soleimani's plan had gone according to his calculations, he would have been next in line to be the president of Iran. Iran would have stopped pretending that it had a moderate president, that the president actually matters. Soleimani would have been the new Ahmadinejad, and the course of history might have gone quite differently. Instead, the United States decided that Soleimani's version of history was not going to happen. And so President Trump erased him from history with one single strike. And that ought to be a lesson for future Soleimanis, that no matter how smart you are, no matter how determined you are, no matter how ruthless you are, the United States can erase you with just one single push of a button. This has been another Daniel Greenfield moment on the Glazov Gang. Please continue to watch the Glazov Gang's YouTube videos and support the show. Thank you very much and have a good night.